It all started just a few months after I had moved in. The noises coming from my ceiling. Honestly, I might not have noticed it if I hadn't spontaneously woken up in the middle of the night to get some water. At first, I had chalked it up to a possible rodent infestation, or perhaps birds had made a small nest somewhere along my roof. It was subtle, just an odd scratching and scraping above my head. I roused from my bed bleary-eyed and slumped over to my door. Just as my hand reached for the knob, a shuffling noise directly above me caught my attention. I paused and looked up confused, wondering what in the world had just made that sound. I knew I hadn't been living in this house very long, but it was quite old, maybe a couple decades at least. So my rationalization was starting to come into play. I waited and stared at my ceiling, trying to discern the noise, but it only sounded a single time. With a heavy yawn, I opened the door, got my water, and went back to bed. While the thought lingered in the back of my mind, it eventually faded over the course of the next day. By the end of that week, I had completely forgotten about that strange sound, until that weekend arrived. Friday evening, I was staying up a bit later than I usually do. I like to get to bed pretty early, since I have to get up for work before 7 a.m. However, I had the next day off, and had lost myself binge-watching The Office on Netflix. I checked my phone and was shocked to see how late it had gotten. Suddenly, it was like all those extra hours hit me at once, and I could feel my eyelids beginning to dip. I shut off the TV and walked down my long hallway towards my bedroom. About halfway down the hallway is when I heard that noise again. That shuffling, scraping sound, like something was moving above me. I glanced up and waited for it to occur a second time, but it never did. I made a mental note to contact animal control and see if they could root out the source of this noise. The following morning when I got up, I contacted one of the many companies listed on Yelp and asked if they'd be willing to come check out my attic. They agreed, but told me it would take a couple of days for scheduling reasons. I thanked them and made an appointment for that Monday. I contacted my boss as well, immediately following the animal control phone call, letting him know that I would be late coming into work on Monday. I explained my situation and he was very understanding about the whole thing. He actually droned on for nearly 20 minutes about how his childhood home had a family of raccoons living in his attic, and they were keeping his family up all night. I hung up shortly after and spent the remaining parts of my weekend relaxing and enjoying my time off. Monday had arrived and animal control were surprisingly punctual. 2 men wearing matching white uniforms were standing on my doorstep. I greeted them, and they asked if I called about the potential rodent problem. I nodded, explaining in detail everything I had been hearing up until that point. One of the men wandered around the perimeter of my house, looking for any potential holes or cracks in my roof, while the other asked a few more follow-up questions. They asked if I had ever been in my attic before, and I told them only a single time since I had moved in. They asked me to sign some liability forms, and once I had, they made their way inside and I led them over to the entrance of my attic. I pulled the string on the staircase, and one of the men brandished a flashlight. He climbed the steps and began peering around in the dark. He remarked not seeing anything unusual. He then climbed all the way up and disappeared into the darkness of the attic. I waited for nearly 5 solid minutes before he returned. He said he looked around and couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. He mentioned seeing no signs or traces of any animals of any kind living up there. Luckily, this company was decent and I didn't have to pay much for the visit. Only a $20 fee for them coming out. And they also told me that if I did happen to locate the source of the animal and contacted them again, they'd come out and remove it for a discount. I half-heartedly thanked them and they left. I'm not sure why, but over the next few weeks, I became increasingly more aware of the sounds that were occurring after dark. I would lie awake a few hours longer just to see if I could hear those noises. Of course, the noises didn't occur every night, but they happened regularly enough to be noticeable. Then, nearly a month and a half after having animal control come out, I heard a sound that shunted me awake. It was the sound of a loud thud directly above my head. I could feel anger and irritation welling within me. My desire to ascertain the source of the noise was beginning to outweigh my willingness to leave it be. The very next morning, I rolled out of bed with purpose. I got dressed and equipped myself with gloves and a flashlight. I stood beneath the ladder and took a few deep breaths before trying to mentally prepare myself. I pulled the hatch down and began to climb up the steps. As my head crested into the attic, I was immediately hit with a wave of mildew and stale air. After taking a moment to acclimate myself to the new atmosphere, I turned the flashlight on and looked around. I readied myself to drop down below in case I found something dangerous. But the longer I searched, the more relaxed I became. There was nothing but wooden planks and dust around me. The attic seemed wholly vacant. I then focused on each portion of the attic more methodically a second time. Upon not seeing anything, I summoned my courage and hoisted myself up into the attic. I walked with a hunch, trying to search the area better. Upon coming up empty-handed, I was about to resign myself to giving up when something out of the edge of the light caught my eye. At first glance, it seemed like some ordinary wooden planks were just randomly stacked vertically off to the side. However, the closer I moved to it, the more I realized what it actually was. It was a door. It appeared very crudely built, but it was most definitely a door or hatch of some kind. Towards the lower middle of the door, there seemed to be a small, tarnished latch. I hesitated for a moment before reaching out and tugging at it. The door released with a gasp when I unlatched it. I pulled it open with a sickening creak. Inside the door revealed a very short pathway. I couldn't see very well from the angle I was currently at, so I made my way inside. What I found inside that space still unsettles me to this day. There was an entire room up here, like a living space for someone or something. It was very small and very cramped, but there was no mistaking it. It had a small bed made out of torn linens and other fabrics, a pile of canned food, some empty and strewn about, a few magazines and newspapers, some old clothes accumulating mold in a corner. I think my visual shock was overpowering my other senses initially, because I was quickly hit by the smell of rotten filth that drove me back out of the door. It was odd. Despite the powerful odor, the scent never carried past the door, probably why the animal guy didn't smell it when he was up here. I took a few sharp breaths of stale air and walked back into the room. I searched with my flashlight, even asking if anyone was up here with me a few times. That's when I noticed a large hole in the far end of the room. It was quite a large hole, probably big enough for a person to fit through. I returned back to the attic and descended the steps. I thought about how the other animal worker didn't mention seeing any other holes on the roof. I looked up at the ceiling and calculated where that hole might lead to. I searched around the edge of my bedroom and bathroom looking for any signs of cracks or openings. When I couldn't locate any, I went outside and wandered around the side of my house. Sure enough, that guy wasn't lying, as there weren't any cracks or openings in my roof. Just then, I noticed something towards the base of my house. There appeared to be a piece of siding that looked off. I grabbed an edge, and to my surprise, it came away with relative ease. Behind the siding was a fairly large hole that entered into the side of my house. I peeked inside and aimed my flashlight up. While it was a rather tight squeeze, I did see wooden planks that seemed to form a makeshift ladder, leading all the way up to the top of my attic. I quickly backed away and called the authorities. Not much later, they arrived and I explained the whole situation to them. At first, they found it hard to believe, but as I led them up to the attic and around the house, their skepticism left their faces. They told me they'd be on the lookout for any strange figures in the area, and they'd take some of the left behind items as evidence. They strongly suggested I fill the hole in my wall in the meantime. To this day, I have no idea who had been living in my attic or for how long, and I'm not sure why. Was it a downtrodden individual trying to find respite from the outside elements, or was it someone with far more sinister intentions? I do know that ever since that day, I haven't heard any more sounds occurring in my attic. One small thing did stick out to me as odd, however. Nearly a day later, I had some construction guys come out to fill the hole with bricks. While I stood there watching them work, I couldn't help but feel eyes upon me, as if someone was staring at me from a distance. When I turned around, I saw no one, just a mess of trees that lined the back of my house.